Thank you for that introduction. I just want to point out one thing to any Cape Townians in the hall. In Port Elizabeth in the Eastern Cape, we also have a mountain with a breathtaking view. That's up there. So this is my favorite slide. You'll see in the distance there, there's a wind farm, the Van Stadens wind farm, which this paper is about. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so firstly, what we're going to look at is why we did this study, why did I conduct it, have a brief overview of some of the, what is a weak grid, what is power quality, and then I'll delve into the case study considered for this paper, considering the Van Stadens wind farm's generation, on-site power quality measurements, and the conclusions. So why did we do this study, or what brought it about? The Van Stadens wind farm, I've been involved with the project fairly from the start, and one of the first things I've noticed was in terms of the wind farm and the requirements and the grid code is that the NRS and the grid code specifies the power quality requirements for the wind farm at the point of connection. And there's, from the wind farm's side, there's very little consideration on what is the power quality at the consumer. So the aim of this was to, instead of looking at the point of connection, what effect does this wind farm have on the consumer, which is, in my opinion, one of the most important factors to look at. Just giving a brief background on some of the things discussed throughout the presentation. Weak grids, what do we consider a weak grid? Distribution networks and typical rural networks are usually characterized by a low XR ratio and a low short circuit ratio. The short circuit ratio being the short circuit power available at the point of connection divided by the generating plant. And previous research suggests that to keep the voltage range between 0.9 and 1.1 per unit, the short circuit ratio should be higher than 2.5. Power quality, some of the parameters being looked at in the study, voltage dips, short supply interruption, and overvoltage. Those are just different terms used to distinguish between different power quality issues that can be experienced. Then harmonics, it's the second thing that I looked at. Harmonics, the one thing I just want to read there, the total harmonic distortion is a measure of the harmonics. A measure of the harmonics is the total harmonic distortion and is defined for electrical networks by that formula. So basically what I want to say is the higher the total harmonic distortion is, the more distorted the waveform is. Total harmonic distortion is kind of a summary of all the harmonics being measured on a system. Okay, so delving into the actual case study, the Metrowind Van Stadens wind farm is a 27 megawatt wind farm connected to the Nelson Mandela Bay municipality, 22 kV network. It consists of 9 3 megawatt turbines. The short circuit power at the point of connection, 101 MVA, resulting in a short circuit ratio of 3.74, which is higher than the recommended 2.5, meaning that although this is a wind farm connected to a rural network, by the previous definition, it's not seen as a weak network. The XR ratio being 5.88. The case study looked at performing 10-minute power quality measurements at 7 different consumers' point of connection, each one for a minimum of 2 weeks per site over a total period of 12 weeks. Here's just an overview of the specific sites and what type of loads was found there. First one, Bergsig Boerdery. It's a dairy farm, consisting mainly of large motor loads and lighting pertaining to the milking and feeding activities. Woodridge College, residencies, classrooms, kitchens, administration blocks. The loads typically electronic and lighting and heating type of loads. The specific substation was very close to the kitchen, so it it was more of a commercial type of load. Ocean View North being a residential area on the outskirts of Port Elizabeth, a coastal residential area with a mix of electronics, lighting, and heating loads. Gamto's Mouth was an electronic type of load found to be intermittent, and it was found that it was, although it was a three-phase connected load supply consumer, it was only a single-phase load that seemed to have been connected there. Then Witteklip repeater, it's a low and constant electronic type load. It's repeater on top of the mountain. That's where that first photo was taken from. Geduldstimber, it's a sawmills. It's a load that was a very high intermittent load. And then Van Stadens Gorge Farm, the consumer is a connection to a borehole pump, but in this case, throughout the study period, this borehole pump was not switched on. So considering the 7 different types of loads, there was a good mix of loads, different load types, different load characteristics, and especially the last one, there was actually no load connected to that site. So that gave us a good base to work from. Then doing the power quality analysis, doing the measurements on these different sites, the RMS value of the voltage anomaly is calculated every 10 milliseconds beyond the thresholds of the reference voltage was measured. And within a 10-minute period, the average, the minimum, and the maximum values were recorded. So although the measurements are taken every 10 milliseconds, only the minimum, average, and maximum values are actually recorded within that 10-minute period. And then that was for the voltage, and then for the harmonics, it only takes the average, the arithmetic average of all the harmonic values registered during that 10-minute period. The Van Stadens wind farm generation, between those dates, 10th of September 2015 and the 3rd of December 2015, the generation output was obtained from tariff metering data. That is the same period through which the different measurements at the 7 sites were taken. Then a statistical approach representing these 10-minute equivalent data per generation bin was used for analysis. So there you'll see a graph of the wind farm's generation throughout the study period. You'll see, wrong button. You'll see each block here is a different bin of 10% output. So when the wind farm was generating between 0 and 10% of maximum, between 10 and 20% of maximum, this represents the amount of times the wind farm was generating within that generation bin. This is just the overview of the study period and which sites were measured where. The one problem that occurred at the Witteklip repeater site, some of the data was corrupted due to a storm activity on the mountain, and not all the data was possible to be extracted. So you'll see that all the sites overlap each other, so during the study period there was always measurements being done somewhere. Because I only had 2 power quality analyzers to use in the study, I couldn't install at all the sites permanently. Then the voltage parameters, as mentioned, were analyzed and compared to its corresponding generation bins. That was one part of the analysis. And the generation bin, as mentioned, meaning that 10-minute measurement period where the wind farm generation was recorded in one of the 10% generation bins between 0 and 100%. And then the second approach was a statistical and correlative approach, was considered to numerically and visually represent the findings. That will become more clear in the following slides. Okay, so some of the parameters that was considered. First one, the percentage generation. It's fairly basic. The generation output over the maximum plant capacity. Just taking the actual generation output and converting it to a percentage value. It was basically just done to better represent it on a graph where more than one parameter was presented. Then second parameter considered, which I refer to as the maximum deviated voltage. The maximum deviated voltage, if we consider the 10-minute values being measured, per phase, you would have a minimum, an average, and a maximum value. What I took the difference between the maximum and the minimum value, changed that to a percentage change within that 10-minute period, and took the maximum of the 3 phases. And that value then I refer to as the maximum deviated voltage. It gave me a percentage change within the 10-minute period. Then to do correlation between voltage and generation, between loading and voltage, I used a standard formula that you can use in Excel. It's called the Pearson product moment correlation coefficient. In Excel, it's just referred to as a correlation. Basically, what I then did was, for those 10% generation bins, the average of all these maximum deviated voltages. So for each measurement point, a maximum deviated voltage was calculated. Where these maximum deviated voltages, it was grouped into a specific generation bin. So what I noticed is that when the generation was below 30% of maximum and when the generation was above 30% of maximum, the averages of these maximum deviated voltages were very similar. Well, wrong one again. So you'll see when the average of the maximum deviated voltage, for instance, at this specific site, Bergsig Boerdery, was 1.34%. Whenever generation was below 30%, and when generation was above 30%, the average was very similar. And this occurred for all the different sites. There was a very close correlation between when generation was below 30% and when generation was above 30%. And the correlation coefficient then indicates this. A positive value very close to 1 indicates there's a close correlation between that. And that basically just indicated to me that whether the wind farm's generation is low or whether it's high, these maximum deviated voltages are the same, telling me that the amount of generation does not affect the maximum deviated voltage. So that was the one part of the assessment. The interesting part that's coming now considers average voltage being the 10-minute average voltage for each phase, and taking the average of that. Second one, the average current. Again, taking the average current within that 10-minute period and taking the average between the 3 phases. So now I've got average voltage, average current. Now, doing correlation between these values, you'll see in this first one, I took the average voltage versus generation, and I correlated the values through all the data sets. And you'll see that all those values are positive. They're not very close to 1, but they're all positive. Most of them are at least above 10%. And when we visually look at this, we'll see that at this specific site, there was no loading. This is the site where there was a borehole that was disconnected, no loading. We'll see that the voltage, this is the voltage over a 24-hour period, and this is the generation over a 24-hour period. And you'll see that there's a very close correlation between how the voltage changes and how the generation changes, indicating that the generation profile is closely correlated to the voltage profile. And bear in mind, in this case, there was no current. Looking just at the same site, different 24-hour periods throughout the study time, you'll see that same correlation between voltage and generation. It closely matches. Okay, so here's this different site, same thing, close correlation between voltage and generation. very close or similar pattern. Now, if we look at the maximum deviated voltage versus generation, you'll see that all those correlation values are close to 0, meaning there's a very, very small, there's no correlation between maximum deviated voltage and generation. And if we look at the graphs, you'll see that whether generation is high or whether generation is low, there's no real correlation with an increase in maximum deviated voltage. This indicating to me that the generation does not have an increased effect on how the maximum deviated voltages occur. Then looking at current, you'll see that in some sites the maximum current is higher than others. With the current, it was the opposite effect. The correlation between the current and the voltage was opposite. It was a negative correlation, and those are also fairly high, which was expected. As current goes up, voltage goes down. And that is seen in the graphs. You'll see the difference between the current and the voltage. And this indicates that as as current goes up, voltage goes down, and vice versa. This is seen throughout. At sites where there's higher current being drawn by the consumer, the effect is bigger. I unfortunately have to move a bit quicker through these. Basically what this tells me is that current has a bigger effect on the voltage at the specific site than the actual generation, indicating that the wind farm's generation does not affect the voltage as much as the actual local current at the different sites do. Comparing the maximum deviated voltage with current, we'll see there's no real correlation between the two. In some cases it's a high correlation, in some cases it's a low correlation. Looking closer to the graphs, there's certain places where you can see where it seems that there's a correlation, but throughout this full period there's nothing really. You'll see that maximum deviated voltages or peak in certain times, not specifically related to current. Let me get to the next section. So in conclusion for the voltage, as I've said, current plays a much bigger role in the voltage than the generation does. Quickly looking at the harmonics, the maximum total harmonic distortion for the different sites also showed very little correlation between there's very little correlation when we look at the total harmonic distortion happens and when there's generation. And this can be seen in this graph. All those dots are specific total harmonic distortion events, and they occur randomly. They don't specifically occur when there's high generation or where there's low generation, but they occur randomly, and they don't even, they're not even linked to the local load. It's as if a specific load in the area has a bigger effect on the harmonics measured at a different site. Random occurrences of, for instance, high generation, but the harmonic events are completely at a different time of the day, different during low generation and during high generation. Indicating again to me that the wind farm is not responsible for those harmonic distortions, it's loads in the area. I think I've gone through the conclusions. Is basically what I've mentioned, that the wind farm generation does not affect the voltage as much as the local loads.
Great, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. Are there any, and for keeping to time as well, are there any questions from the audience?
I want to ask about when you are doing the correlation in regard to the voltage, when you are classifying the bins, as you put it, you use 30% of generation. Why specifically 30%?
Okay, so each bin there was still just 10% bins, but I lumped the 10%, 20%, and 30% bins together to create a group. The reasoning behind that was basically that once generation, I think below 30% or below 25%, the requirements on the wind farm is less, so it does not need to comply with the same amount of reactive power support to the grid and so on. So it was probably a random choice in choosing the 30%, but it was just to group it in two parts. I didn't want to say 50-50 because generation between 30% and 50%, the wind farm is still generating or was still required to generate and provide full reactive power support to the grid.
Would we have the same results if like you considered like at 60% of generation?
Sorry, you saying?
Would we have the same results if you would have taken 60%, let's say, as an example?
What I've noticed was if I had to do that same comparison take the average of the 10% bin, take the average of the 20% bin, and so on, those averages would still be very similar. That I did notice. The reason why I only chose to do it in this manner for the presentation is, and for the paper, was because instead of having to visualize and show for each 10% bin, it would have taken even longer and more space.
Okay, thank you. I think we have another question over here.
Hello, sir. My name is Yanga. I'm also from the Eastern Cape. I am quite aware that there's a number of wind power systems in the Eastern Cape, including the Tsitsikama community wind power, I think.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, the wind power systems, are they for locals, as in the community members, or are they for private businesses? Because I'm quite sure that there is a lot of people in the communities in the Eastern Cape that do not have electricity. There's a lot of schools as well that don't have electricity. So do they cater for businesses or the locals?
Okay, look, the generation from these wind farms are most of the times, or I think in all these round one cases, they're all connected to the Eskom grid. The Van Stadens wind farm is connected to the municipality's grid, but the power is still sold to Eskom. So the power generated is fed into the local distribution and transmission grid, so it's used by everybody. So it's not specifically linked to a specific business or specific community. I can however add that with all these projects, they do have a social responsibility to uplift the communities in the area. Future projects are trying to avoid connecting to Eskom or selling to Eskom due to red tape. And in those projects, power is specifically sold through a third-party company. I think its name has changed so many times. It's called PowerX now. They buy power from these projects and sell it into businesses and different places.
Thank you so much.
Okay, there are no more questions, then I think thank you very much, Clement.
Thanks.
Okay, hello. As Tobias already pointed out, I'm from Frankfurt in Germany. The title might look a bit strange, perhaps, especially the first few letters. This is the Z.A was meant to stand for South Africa. The PyPSA is Python for Power System Analysis, which is in Toolbox we're developing in Frankfurt, which I'll have a small slide later on. The work here is basically use the Toolbox, try to take data the CSIR, especially John Kalitz, provided to me, who's hiding in the back, I suppose, and try to find out what this means for the South African power system in the next 30 years. More specifically, what it means, now I figured it out, what it means to, so how do you want to cost optimally serve the South African electricity demand in the 1 year, 2040? If the generation capacities which will still be there, so some of them will still be there, can then be extended by extra gas, by nuclear, by coal, and well, especially by new wind and PV installations combined with battery storage units. And since there is now varying energy sources in there, it's not really the same way it worked before, that you just take the peak demand and then add some extra margin on there and have your generators which can provide this peak demand, and then perhaps do some kind of extra grid studies, but you have to do it in more or less at the same time. So you want to take into account the spatial and temporal correlations of the renewable energy sources and the load, which means that we want to optimize the power plant dispatch for a full year. So which wind turbine feeding energy into the grid, when is which power plant providing energy, when is coal burned, and optimally also combine it with a load flow which results from this power plant dispatch to check that all the transmission limits are fine. This then becomes easily enormous optimization problems. So we're here trying just for a small grid with 27 nodes, which are the supply regions which have been defined by ASCOM. So a bit more precisely, so we want to minimize the total costs of the system, which are composed of a capital part, which is not time dependent. You just pay to have the capacity of wind turbines, of coal plants, and marginal costs, which are time dependent. Do I burn fuel or not? And minimize those. Whoa, sorry, I'm not, now I'm better. And minimize those by changing the capacities I have available in all places, the transmission capacities I have available, and how I will dispatch them when I actually use the energy from the wind, from coal plant. And a lot of other extra constraints which I also have to fulfill. So I want to have the energy demand has to be satisfied in every hour, in every region. I need to have the generator limits and the storage can only feed in energy if there's any left, of course. And for renewables, it's especially important that you only produce energy when there's actually wind blowing, for example, or when the sun is shining. So you have to get quite a lot of data first, which the CSIR was nice enough to make available to me. So, and the system which we're looking at is on the spatial scale looks a bit like that. So the 27 supply regions that ASCOM defined previously, and overlaid. So in the as gray areas, basically, there is the grid which you have now, which I more or less projected onto those supply regions to give you the grid in red, which I started from, and then added extra transmission lines if they were needed between, or well, more or less the optimization did that, between the different buses. Then you put into that where the load will be in 2040 and how huge it will be. For now, this is just, you have the energy system demand in an hourly resolution by ASCOM, and then you split it up by population to the different regions. You add in the existing generation capacities, so mostly coal in the northwest, the nuclear power plant, which will still be around Köberg, and a couple of hydro installations. And you then take the wind and solar availabilities, which means define when does wind blow where, so you can feed in energy. This was helpfully done by the Fraunhofer-Eves Institute together with the CSIR in 2015 in this wind resource, wind and PV solar PV resource aggregation study by Bofinger and Tobias and so on. And also, to answer the question which came up earlier on in the first session, not really to answer it, but to say, is there enough wind resources? The answer is probably yes, at least as far as the study by Bofinger and the Fraunhofer-Eves in general found. They didn't go to the same detail than the first session went to. And this is not what they're trying to do, but rather they want to have an aggregated estimate. And this estimate says that in those regions, these REDS regions, you can generate 10 times the amount of energy you will need in 2040 by excluding a lot of land use areas. If you then take in, so if we then have to only take like 1/10 of that because we don't want it, it's not visually pleasing and so on, then it would still be fine basically. So there is a lot of leftover space, even and outside of the REDS. So I would say you are really, well lucky in a sense. The resources are awesome. You then add in the thermal generation capacities as well in specific places where you're thinking about building them. So like for gas, it's the ports and so on. Don't have anything on that. And try to come up with good numbers for how much everything will cost in 2040. Most of the numbers here, I won't go into the detail. It's really just just trying to flash them at you. Most of them, especially for the thermal generation, is based on the Integrated Resource Plan draft in 2016. The rest, so the renewable energy and the battery, is from the CSIR, who calculated it from the renewable RIPPBP pricing scheme, which you had in 2015, and then a moderate learning curve. So let's just write over let's go to what it comes out if you do that. It's a bit complicated, but I try to take you from the top left. So in here you see the energy balance, the energy mix. So what is producing which energy after having curtailment everything in. And so the model went for a 70% renewable energy system. It shows you, but in the lower part, the costs associated with different components. So you have a transmission grid component, you have a wind and solar component, and the coal, which is still there. There is no new coal built. There is no new nuclear built. The old coal power stations, which will still be around, are dispatched to cover a quarter of the load. And some battery is used to balance it all, together with new gas power plants which are in here. On the right-hand side, you have the map which shows you where the capacities are located. So you're taking mostly trying to get the good spots up in Namaqualand and Kimberley, and especially Karoo, since the transmission lines there are good. And it also can identify which new transmission corridors it would need to transport that energy then away to the load centers. So you, in red, basically, the red parts of the transmission lines are which new corridors, new expansions, which go from northwestern, and there's one more down here between Pinetown and East London. It would achieve a 40% CO2 reduction if the power system was driven that way. So I could stop here, would be fine, but actually this is not what the modeling says, because, I mean, this will not happen in that way. This depends on some cost assumptions. If you add in other cost assumptions, slightly different prices come out. If, for example, the cost reduction in PV was quite a bit stronger than what I set into here, we would have a lot more PV in the system. But we can ask questions to the model now. We can ask what will happen if we add in the nuclear and coal, if we force it to build the nuclear and coal that you might want to have. And it turns out that the prices will be, so the prices for the solution the model finds will be like 20% higher, a bit less than 20%. It will then generate like more than half of the energy with coal and nuclear, leading to a higher CO2 emissions. And if you ask now, okay, go the other way around and instead try to minimize or try to have less CO2 emissions, you actually could go as low as 10 megatons CO2 and also get it at a cost of something like an extra 20%. So basically similar to the I build nuclear and coal capacities case, only that now you have a 16th of the CO2 emissions. What is, so it's not quite clear how, so the prices basically don't contain everything. So this is not the price you would pay in the end. There is no distribution grid considered, for example, which would add probably something like another 200 to the prices, but everywhere the same. So the relative distinctions would still be the same. And well, one last thing is that if you wanted to reach something like this solution as a business case, then you would need a CO2 price on the order of 1,870 rands a ton, which is not it's not really astronomical. In Sweden, they have a comparable CO2 price for everything that's not covered by the EU TTS. To compare this, and because I said it's very price sensitive, the bars on the left are basically what you have already seen, except for the emission prices one, which I'm not going into detail here. But the bars on the right are the base case, the least cost case, and the business as usual case, where you force coal and nuclear capacities each for different prices. For the prices you have today, where you also would be cheaper by just going with a lot of new renewables, no new coal capacities, no new nuclear capacities, to the moderate price reductions for renewables, to an aggressive price reductions of renewables as it was forecasted by the Bloomberg New Energy Finance, for example. Finally, just one more thing. If one would to lift this restriction to the focus zones and allow to also build in corridors along the transmission lines away from the focus zones, then the model actually also expands in some areas where the resource of wind is lower, like in low veld and high veld, which it's using to make the wind energy in feed and over the whole country a bit smoother, because you have less correlation between the eastern part and the lower southwestern part here, which then gives you a really, really small price reduction and especially you need less flexibility, which you can see in the amount of gas in the system and the amount of batteries you have to build. All of this has been done as a PyPSA model, as I have said. I pushed this online. Everybody can rerun that by just basically flicking a switch. The only well, no, I didn't want to go forward. The only thing which is not done yet is basically the small thing that GitHub says down here: help people interested in this repository understand your project by adding a README. I haven't come around to actually describing how everything fits together, so you will have to get into contact with me. Yeah, this is just a short slide on the PyPSA thing, but I think I'm running out of time, so I will just head to the conclusion and tell you again that the model tries to optimize investment operation in South Africa in 27 buses hourly resolution, and finds a cost-optimal solution based on wind and solar PV, which is balanced by battery storage and gas generation, together with some transmission capacity expansions. In no cases you build coal, but if you or nuclear capacities, but if you enforce that, you get a 20% higher cost within the model assumptions, of course. And with a similar cost, you can also achieve a reduction down to 10 megaton or million ton CO2. Thanks. Questions, please.
Okay. Thank you, Jonas, very much for the very interesting presentation. Nice next step of what we have seen last year at the WindAc and WindABA. So are there questions in the room on the results?
Hi. I just want to find out about the treatment of your emissions. Just how credible is the coal that you're building?
Can you just point out where you are? It's just hard
right
if I don't see you. You're good, thanks.
Sorry, and please mention your name and affiliation as well.
My name is Sipo.
Hi.
Yeah. Okay. I just want to know from you how are you dealing with the CO2 emissions in your optimizations, specifically with regards to how it actually affects your overall optimizations. In the business as usual, you're building coal in 2040, or you're forcing in coal in 2040. Is that really? Let me finish. Is that really a credible coal? I mean, in a sense that. I just want to know how you are projecting your CO2 emission. Would it not be possible, for example, that in 2040, your coal is actually operating at very high load factors based on your CO2 emissions that you're putting in, whereas in 2040, according to the draft RP 2016, the Department of Energy has got aspirations of reducing the CO2 emissions. I want to know, I think, just to summarize, are your CO2 emissions forward-looking? Is your optimizations able to factor, even though you optimize up to 2040, is your model actually able to look beyond 2040, such that it's able to optimize a prudent generation capacity?
So the question is more or less, can you also do the same optimization, not only for the year 2040, but for other years and other goals of CO2 reductions? Or this is what I'm going to answer.
No, that's not the question.
That's not a question, okay,
no,
sorry.
No, that is not the question. The thing is, the question is your model actually able to look forward, look beyond, a little bit beyond 2040, say 2042?
In this, I'm not quite sure I get the question.
Yeah.
The only thing where the reference here actually factors in is how huge will your demand be. The demand here is the high demand base case for the year 2040 of the IRP. So if you then add up the demand to a bit of a higher level, you can also rerun the optimization for 2042. but I'm not sure this is what you're asking.
No, it's not.
Maybe-
Okay, let me.
Maybe it's
let
best-
I'm
me-
sorry.
Maybe it's best to have a bilateral discussion
Okay, yeah, just
outside.
one
I think
last
that will be
question.
easier to.
Yeah, just one last question, Chair.
Okay,
I just
another?
want to know the assumptions you're making around the capacity credits for wind. Are you making any assumptions around that? Can you just elaborate on that?
About the capacity factors for wind?
Capacity credits for wind.
There's no capacity credits for wind
Why?
in there, I think.
We know that
Because it-
wind is able to reduce or contribute to reducing peak demand in South Africa. Where are you coming from?
I'm coming from Germany, as I said. Um,
Okay, maybe another point that can be discussed, one
it
by one.
seems
I think
like it.
I think knowing both sides, I think it's perfectly fine. It's all captured, but I think you should discuss it one by one. Yeah. Sorry, another question?
Yes, good.
Richard? Yeah.
Thanks.
That's fine. Then
Richard
go ahead.
Worthington, the Civil Society.
Okay.
The question is, firstly, to check, did I understand that within your optimization, you limited renewables entirely to the renewable energy development zones identified in the strategic environmental assessment? And then you said, well, you can relax that constraint, if I understand correctly, and allow it also to build in the corridors. And then we started to see wind in the Highveld in areas where there's currently coal. Now, my understanding is that the Department of Environmental Affairs is keen, I don't know if they're doing it, but they were talking about doing, looking at additional REDs, including in areas that are highly dependent on coal, not just for electricity, but economically dependent on coal. So we already started to see that you were starting to utilize wind in areas where you're not driven so much by the resource, but by the nature of the system, the existing infrastructure, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Would you be able to extend this to looking at an optimization that isn't driven entirely by cost, but might be around the same philosophy used in the strategic environmental assessment of where is it that we most need development, where is it we most need to offset the impacts of it or create a just transition?
So, okay, to answer that, there's basically two options you can take if you want to have separate goals in mind as well. The one option is you define caps, which you allow and not allow. So you say, yes, you don't want it here, or I want in total only as much. This is the one possibility. The second possibility, which is more in line with kind of a multi-objective thing, would be you price your separate multi-objectives. So you say, I don't want as many CO2 emissions, okay, then I add a CO2 price. And then the relative size between the CO2 price and the rest of the system defines basically the importance of your different objectives. You can choose to take either of the two routes. Yes, it would work in that optimization, or those two routes are available within the model.
Okay, thank you. Let's have one more question. I think there was one over there. Unfortunately, we can only take one more because we are running out of time. But that was...
Good morning,
That was-
Karel Ruitsma from Mainstream Renewable Power. So I'm one of the industry guys.
Okay, good.
Are they?
Yes, thanks. A lot of people were pointing at you.
I know. That's why I'm just waving. First of all, the study. What is not the outcome of the study, but to whom is it actually presented, or what is the start of the study? Why was it completed, and to whom are you presenting it going forward, considering it is one of those very contentious issues within South Africa? But then one of my concerns, obviously, is you said you excluded transmission distribution costs, yet looking at the least coal or least carbon, you have to increase your transmission quite substantially. So wouldn't that completely throw off your numbering of your costs going through the three cases? And are you planning to actually incorporate that? You're looking at the load plan as well going forward with the development of South Africa. Because it's not necessarily that the load will be increasing in Gauteng, it might actually start moving southwards. Are you looking at that as well?
So, so the first thing is, where did the study come from? The study came from me meeting Tobias at the wind integration workshop last year, and then having a collaboration between our group in Frankfurt and the CSIR. And so we spent a couple of weeks, close to a month basically, on it to come up with this first version. Where is it going? Is, as of now, not totally clear. We want to extend it, so there will be an extended version which is rather looking into the breadth, which means include other sectors like the like electric vehicles, or there's not much heating, but well, other sectors. For the distribution grid, the point is, as long as you stay with utility PV scale installations far from the usual distribution grid, you will actually not have a relative impact on the distribution grids. It's a bit of a torn by the hair argument, because you will have household close installations of PV, but I don't think this is possible to incorporate this in this model. If yeah. Okay, so then one last sentence on that. The one last sentence would be, if you focus on utility scale, it doesn't change with all the different scenarios, whether you take coal, nuclear, or whatever, but it's the same everywhere because you just have to serve the load locally. Wow. Yeah.
Thanks, Tobias. So yes, I'll be presenting, and I'm glad Jonas went through all the mathematics, so I'm not going to have to go through that. I'll skip through some of that, but some of these discussions are important on the transmission and the distribution network costs, and that was the reason that that extended work was done. The intention of this work is to extend on the work that was presented last year at WindAber, and just provide an updated view and an updated set of outcomes that we're starting to see if we make some different technology cost assumptions, and also look at a few different demand scenarios. So that's the outline. Just provide some background, the approach that we took, give you an idea of what the scenarios were, the new research outcomes, and then more specifically, because it is WindAC, a focus on wind and what the wind market could look like in South Africa as a result of these outcomes, and then some conclusions. So I'll just give some context first. I think most are quite familiar with this, being in the wind industry, but globally, the deployment of wind has increased significantly in the last 10 years, with between 40 to 60 gigawatts being added per year, pretty much for almost 7 to 8 years now. And I'll just put a relative comparison there to what the total size of the South African power system is in terms of installed capacity, around the 45 gigawatt level. So essentially what that means is from around 2009 onwards, the world has been adding 1 South Africa in installed capacity of wind per year. What's really interesting though in the last few years is most capacity has actually been added in China, 23 gigawatts last year, and the next closest ones are actually a lot smaller than that. So China is starting to dwarf most other regions that are deploying wind. I just showed a few numbers there. For the US, it's about 8.2 gigawatts, Germany 5.4 gigawatts, and India 3.6 gigawatts in 2016. And relatively speaking, in South Africa, there was about 0.4 gigawatts in 2016. But I'll go through some of those details in the slides to come. And this is now the cumulative capacity. So the previous slide was annual installed capacity. This is now the cumulative capacity around the world. As you can see, China dominates along with Europe and the US. But as I mentioned already, there's some strong growing markets, India being one of those, and you can already see it's just under 30 gigawatts. I've also just noted there that by the end of 2016, there was about 1.5 gigawatts of installed capacity in South Africa. And I'll go through a bit more detail on that in the next slides where I go through the South African context. So to provide the South African context, I'll give you a quick summary of the very difficult word that people are finding to pronounce, the RERPP. It's really an interesting program that's resulted in significant cost reductions, and I'll just give an idea of what that has been from the first bid window in November 2011 to November 2015. And with a specific focus on wind, it's about a 60% reduction in the tariffs that have been bid in the space of just 4 years. Specifically, I've also shown solar PV there in the yellow, probably on a much stronger technology cost learning curve. So an 80% reduction in 4 years. And an interesting one, which is something that we should probably keep an eye out for, is CSP, which has also had quite significant cost reductions, but really only in the last bid window where it came down quite significantly from where it was before. And I'm sure most people are quite familiar with a lot of bids that are being bid around the world, specifically in the Middle East, on CSP and what the costs are that those are coming in at. So in terms of South Africa and highlighting wind, this is the operational capacity by the end of the year since 2013. We've updated it all the way to the first half of 2017, so you can see it's, as I mentioned previously, just under 1.5 gigawatts by the end of 2016. There was one wind farm added in 2017, at least in the first half of 2017, so just under 1.6 gigawatts is now operational in South Africa. Combined with that, the two other major technologies as part of the RERPP program. And the yellow is solar PV at a similar level, just about 1.5 gigawatts. And the first few CSP plants, around 200 megawatts, is now operational. Others are still under construction. So if we then look at just the past 3 years and the relative contribution of wind to the total South African power system, you go from the far left-hand side in 2014, it was about 1.1 terawatt hours, so just under 0.5%, 0.4% of the total energy contribution from wind. And then most recently last year in 2016, when we had that 1.5 gigawatts of wind operational, it contributed about 3.7 terawatt hours, or about 1.6% to the energy mix. So although from a very low base, it seems to be quite a growing market as a result of the RERPP program. And hopefully I'll be able to provide some future perspectives on what this may look like into the future based on some of the research outcomes. So in terms of the approach that's taken, you might be quite familiar with this. The Integrated Resource Plan in South Africa is a centrally planned process, and the approach that we take is very, very similar. We look at the existing capacity, the under construction capacity, as well as the capacity that's committed. So that you can see is the existing coal fleet, quite a dominant coal fleet, the existing nuclear, hydro, the wind being commissioned, solar PV, as well as CSP. The solid black line is the curve that goes up quite significantly, at least on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, a bit less. But what's important is that in any of those, whether you have on the left-hand side quite a high demand forecast or a low demand forecast, what we could consider a low demand forecast, there's this opening supply gap that starts to happen, and South Africa does need to invest in electricity infrastructure, more specifically in generation capacity, just at varying levels of deployment over time. So I think one more thing before I move on to the next slide here is that, although I don't say it explicitly anywhere, the time horizon over which this is done is from today to 2050. And it's full optimization across that full time horizon. Now, this is what has been discussed in some of the previous presentations, more specifically, Jonas, just before myself, where the optimization that we are doing at the moment uses a tool called Plexos, which is one that, at this stage, at least the modeling approach that's being taken, optimizes the generation component of that, which is, largely speaking, the dominant component of that. The model doesn't necessarily include the transmission, the distribution network components, system services, or other costs, metering, billing, customer services. Those do have cost adders, of course. For now, as part of the approach that we took, we didn't really do too well, it seems. We assumed a 30 cents per kilowatt hour value for all of those cost components into the future to get to a total system cost. This is then to just give you an idea of what the total system cost is. What's more important is that generation cost component and how each of the scenarios compare relative to each other. Of course, each of those scenarios that come out of the planning process will have different transmission or distribution infrastructure requirements. We may need to have slightly different adders for each of those scenarios. You could also implicitly include that in the optimization, of course, and start to include more and more of those costs in the inherent optimization that you perform. of course, with the overhead of additional computational complexity, it takes a lot more time to solve those kind of problems and becomes much more difficult to solve in an acceptable time. So now in terms of the scenarios, if you were at WindAber last year, you would have seen pretty much most of the results that are in the top 4 or 5 scenarios there. So a business as usual, a least cost, a decarbonized scenario for high and low demand forecasts. Those are those top 5. I've put a link at the bottom there. There's also more information in the paper if you are interested, but I'm going to try and focus on some of the more recent outcomes, which are the bottom 2. So it's essentially least cost outcomes for a high and low demand forecast, as I showed in the previous slide, with updated assumptions on technology costs, which I'll go through in the next few slides. And these are these key input assumptions. Some of them I might skip through just because they're quite well known and they have been gone through in previous presentations. And so as I say, happy for us to discuss afterwards, but please refer to the paper for all of the technology cost assumptions. But the major ones we just present here as an LCOE number. Of course, in the actual modeling framework, you have the full technology cost characteristics that are modeled. So you have the capital costs, or at least overnight costs, you have the fixed O&M costs, you have variable costs, fuel costs. All of those costs are actually included in the modeling framework, and the optimization then optimizes based on those costs that you then provide it with. So on the left-hand side, you can see the latest bid windows for the solar PV and wind in South Africa. On the right-hand side, costs for a range of technologies, the major ones, so baseload coal supply and nuclear, CCGT gas or OCGT, as well as mid-merit coal, and the existing diesel open cycle gas turbines. What's really important to remember, though, when you present this, is each generator has a particular function that they fulfill. So you need to really take that number, that LCOE number, into consideration when you look at the capacity factor. So the capacity factor at which it's operating at is an assumption that's put there just to give you an idea of how it typically operates, and therefore the cost, levelized cost that it would come in at. But the model doesn't necessarily make any implicit assumptions about what that capacity factor needs to be. It inherently optimizes that capacity factor and chooses any new build technologies that you need to build into the future, into the energy mix. I've also just noted the CO2 intensity of each of the different new build generators at the bottom there, but more detail you can find in the paper if you're interested. So this is just to give you an idea of that existing committed or under construction capacity, and then how that decommissions into the future. As you can see, and as most people know, it's a dominated coal mix. There is quite a bit of hydro, mostly the import from Cohorobas in Mozambique. There's also the existing Koeberg power station, the peaking OCGTs run on diesel at the moment. And then you can also start to see the REIPP program, solar PV, CSP, and wind commissioning early on, and actually during the time horizon, also decommissioning towards the end of the time horizon. I also just wanted to quickly focus on the dominant coal fleet and how that decommissions over time. So what we've put here is the coal fleet, but broken down on a per power station basis, and how that decommissions over time. As you can see, initially, we're commissioning the new build Medupi and Kusile power stations, so the coal capacity goes up towards 2020 and just post-2020. Thereafter, we start to, at least based on the plans that have been published in the draft RP 2016, start to decommission the coal fleet over time. And I've focused on it per decade basis here. Just under 10 gigawatts will be decommissioned between 2020 and 2030, about 15 gigawatts between 2030 and 2040, and then 7 gigawatts between 2040 and 2050. The result of which means by 2050, the only coal capacity still remaining, existing coal capacity still remaining, is Medupi and Kusile power stations, as well as one unit at Majuba. So just about 10 gigawatts. So on the demand forecast, this is the high and the low demand forecast. I just wanted to stress the difference between the two. So the high demand forecast has about 2.1 times the 2015 demand. The low demand forecast about 1.6 times the 2015 demand. And the difference between the two is that in the high demand forecast, it's about 1.4 times the low demand forecast by 2050. In either of these cases, as I showed in the previous slides, there is new capacity that needs to be invested in because of that decommissioning predominant coal fleet, but also other capacity providers. So we do need to make investments into the electricity sector, specifically in generation, and I'll show you some of the outcomes from those scenarios that I presented earlier. So this is spoken about a bit previously, but this is existing policy in South Africa. The legally binding peak plateau decline, moderate decline scenario, the bold brown curve at the bottom there. So from 2025 onwards, a maximum of 275 million tons of CO2 in the electricity sector is assumed. That stays pretty much flat and then starts to decline from just post 2035 towards 2050, which means by 2050 you get to the 210 million tons. So that effectively puts a constraint in the overall optimization on how much CO2 can come from the electricity sector in the long term. So more importantly, these are the new assumptions. All of that we know from before, and we presented a lot of that last year. The new assumptions we've taken from the starting point today, the 62 cents per kilowatt hour for solar PV in the REIPP program, and assumed a linear decline from today to 2040 of a reduction based on the Bloomberg New Energy Finance New Energy Outlook of 70% reduction by 2040. Now, it's purposefully made optimistic to really test the boundaries on what if solar PV gets to these levels? What if, and I'll show you in the next slide, wind gets to much cheaper levels? What starts to happen in the energy mix relative to previous outcomes that we've presented? So this is now the one for wind. So from today, also quite a linear decline to 2040, about a 40% reduction by 2040, so in about 24 years to 2040, and then it's flat thereafter. Although I didn't talk to it in the previous slide, we've also shown the draft RP assumptions at the moment from the draft RP 2016 as well as the RP 2010. So quite considerably higher, as you can see, so that's where you'll start to see differences in the outcomes and the scenarios that we present. This is now CSP, so concentrated solar power. We take from the latest bid window and assume a similar learning, or at least shape of learning, of CSP as a technology relative to the RP 2010, because to follow the RP 2016, it was already above that, so we needed a new reference to work with, so we followed that trajectory towards 2030 and then kept the technology flat thereafter. So this is also one of the other big differences. In the original draft RP 2016, there was no learning assumed on storage. It's still quite nascent, very new. So probably you could argue a bit of risk in deploying stationary storage, but we wanted to really test what if these projections were realized. Similarly, these projections are based on BNF as well as IRENA, and more specifically for stationary storage lithium ion, we assume around about the $200 per kilowatt hour by 2030. I know that the y-axis there is actually in rands, but the equivalent dollar amount is $200 per kilowatt hour by 2030, the $150 by 2040, and $100 per kilowatt hour by 2050. So now that I've gone through the really important assumptions, I'll try and skip through the demand shaping side because I really want to get to the scenarios. I've got 3 minutes left, it seems. So what we do is we assume two demand side shaping opportunities. One of them is electric water heating, so domestic electric water heating. And if you're interested, you can go and have a look at what these the parameters are that define this. But I'll try and skip through this just to give an idea of some of the outcomes and the really interesting parts of this. The other opportunity is electric vehicles and the use of electric vehicles for demand shaping in the long term. Not necessarily in early on 2020, but towards 2030, 2040, and 2050. So I'll rather go to the outcomes, and this is where it's probably more interesting. So in terms of the outcomes, if you look at the three panels there, on the left-hand side is installed capacity to 2050 from today. The middle is the energy produced, and the right is the system cost as well as the average tariff. Effectively, what starts to happen is you use your existing coal fleets as much as possible, so you run it as hard as you can into the future. You also build new open-cycle gas turbines for peaking capacity and some closed-cycle gas turbines, but the dominant part of the energy mix is solar PV and wind deployed, combined with new storage. There's a little bit of pump storage that is built in the model, but more importantly, because of those cost trajectories on stationary storage that we made, it also does start to deploy some lithium-ion stationary storage to then also provide that capacity requirement. You can see on the right-hand side, the system, because it becomes much bigger, increases from about $14 billion today to $30 billion by 2050. But an interesting outcome is that the expected average tariff as a result of this modeling outcomes would actually reduce in absolute terms into the future because of that large learning trajectory that you start to see when you deploy more and more extremely cheap solar PV and very cheap wind into the future. Now, I won't go through the CO2 emissions and the water, but you can see they go down as you expect. I'll show that in one of the next slides. This is the low demand, and also not necessarily as interesting anymore because I presented the previous slide, but very similar deployment, just at a smaller scale because of the lower demand forecast. So I'll skip through this just to get to the wind focus, which is probably also more interesting at WindAc. So there's the CO2 emissions trajectory you can see it doesn't actually hit that cap, so the cap never becomes binding. We don't even hit the 275 million ton cap, and it actually starts to decline linearly from the mid-2020s onwards. A similar trajectory is noted there for water as well, so water really reduces quite significantly into the future. So now at least a focus on wind. I'll try and fly through this. I think I've got 1 minute left, maybe 1 minute. So the previous outcomes on the left-hand side, you can see quite a significant share of wind in the mix from today about just below 2% towards almost half, so 50% by 2050. The rest of that renewable energy share is mostly solar PV, some biomass, and a bit of CSP. Both in the low and the high demand forecast, those previous outcomes were quite similar. When you now apply these lower technology cost assumptions, you still have a similar deployment of wind, so just below the 50%, between 45 and 50% for wind, but you do deploy a lot more solar PV because you start to deploy storage and are able to shift the energy into times when you need it into the future. So you have a much higher share of solar PV in the mix as part of the new outcomes compared to the previous outcomes that we presented. So now what does that mean for the wind market into the future? I'll just quickly run through this, but it effectively means that in any scenarios, whether it's these ones that we presented now, the ones presented last year, the business as usual scenarios, carbon budgets, there is a growing wind market in South Africa, but at varying levels and scales of deployment into the future. So you can see, I'll just give an example, from 2030 to 2040, anywhere between 1.4 and 5.1 gigawatts per year could be deployed. The least cost outcomes would be a lot higher than that, so more in the region of 3 to 5 gigawatts per year between 2030 and 40. But these are just to give you an idea of this relative scale of the deployment of wind that you could then expect as a result of that. So I think my time's up. Happy for you to then read this, but I think I've gone through the fundamental conclusions from the outcomes of the research. And yeah, happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Jared. You actually had 30 seconds left, but
I'll go through them.
So
if you want.
we have them for questions. Please.
I knew Seppo was going to ask something.
Hi, Jared. I just want to know, first of all, do you agree that the gas that you're building is used to back up the intermittency of renewables? And if so, I want to know from you which gas plant specifically has been used to balance the intermittency of renewable, given that the CCGT plant, which you have in your least cost plan, is limited to about 550 stars over the 30-year economic life.
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer that. So most of the variability, I don't like to call it intermittency, but we can discuss that. And most of the variability of the PV and wind is dealt with the OCGTs, yes. And the full technical characteristics of these plants are considered and inherently captured in the modeling. So it wouldn't be an outcome shown here unless the model adhered to those constraints that are considered. So what we do, and I didn't necessarily go through it too much here, we run the LT long-term capacity expansion plan. And then for selected years, we run also MT-ST or short-term production cost modeling runs and unit commitment economic dispatch runs to make sure that, for example, when you have a maximum number of starts per year or commit properties to particular generators, for example, the coal fleet, if you wanted to make sure the coal fleet didn't start and stop too much, all of those technical characteristics are inherently captured in the modeling process. So the outcomes that are shown here are part of that. And what we try to do is we try to almost iterate back and forth in case we get to an area where you run the MT and the system isn't necessarily adequate. We try and put some additional constraints into the LT expansion to really capture that reality that you won't be able to operate a system that may have been built in the long-term expansion in the real world, so to speak.
There's one here, one. Oh, there's
Hello.
Is there one question here? Okay. Didn't see that.
I have a question, please. I kind of observed that you are decommissioning the coal power plants and trying to replace them with renewables, which is wind and solar. But my concern is, how do you want to achieve stability here when you decommission the coal power plants and the battery energy system is almost constant?
So I didn't hear the last part. You decommission?
I said, my question is, how do you intend to achieve stability when you want to replace use the renewable energy as the base load centers, and the batteries almost constant. How do you manage the intermittency?
So effectively what the model chooses to do, so that is inherently captured, not necessarily stability in the strictest sense, because that's then determined after the outcomes of the model. Then you could also have an iterative process there, but the stability of the system is ensured by at least running a particular amount of synchronous generators. As you can see there, it's not just solar PV and wind, and they also don't fulfill a base supply role. They fulfill a role based on their profile that you have. If you look on the far left-hand side, the installed capacity, at least in 2050, you install a lot of capacity there, that's sort of light cream color, as well as the existing coal fleet. That capacity combined with the storage in these outcomes provides you with that capacity to ensure adequacy. The stability question, if it's related to transient or frequency stability, is something that needs to then be assessed after this, because it's not inherently naturally captured in here, but it is something that can be imposed as a natural constraint on the model if you'd want to ensure that 10 synchronous generators are run at any particular time over all the hours of the year, for example. That is something that can be captured if it's something that we want to capture. This is just to really drive down and get to the point of, if this is the least cost, it's the absolute least cost. But if we now need to start making adjustments, what are those adjustments and what will they cost? So we can get an idea of the cost implications of them.
Okay. Let's have one last question over here. Just one more, because it's either question or lunch, and I'm sure you want to have lunch, so one question.
I'm sure so that you've partially answered my question in the previous.
Okay.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, you said that the distribution network is not included in the model. Are you looking into that? Because I believe that is going to affect the cost statistics.
Yes, distribution costs are definitely going to be considered, and it's part of ongoing research. This is just one research group within the CSR Energy Center that's looking at the systems modeling components. And specifically, this is just one project within the one research group. Within that research group itself, there's also work looking at distribution networks that are going to be required, how the distribution networks need to be strengthened in future, and what additional networks may be needed. As you know, South Africa has quite a high electrification rate, but we don't have 100% electrification rate, so we're still going to have to build more network infrastructure. But most of the infrastructure is going to be replacement infrastructure or upgrades of existing infrastructure, and it is something that needs to be considered. But as I showed in the slides towards the beginning, hopefully I'll be able to get to them, unless you're too hungry. The relative cost contribution of distribution is something that needs to be considered, so it's that one sort of in the middle there, but it isn't necessarily the fundamental cost driver to change scenario outcomes, so to speak. It's something that needs to be considered, and it will change the absolute number, but it won't necessarily change the relative outcomes between different scenarios that you consider. Cool.
Great. Thank you very much, Jared.
Okay.
Thanks again for the presentation.
I actually saw the two presentation titles a while ago, and I was worried that I wouldn't be saying the same things these guys do, but it does coincide with what they say, which I'm very glad to find out actually just now. So, I'm very glad to be here at WindAc. My name is Errol, and I work at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. This is a research institution based in Colorado, United States, and it has about 2,000 engineers and scientists all researching in the renewable energy space, and we're funded mostly by the US Department of Energy. So today I'm going to be presenting on the South Africa grid integration study, and should have learned how to use this. So the agenda of this presentation will be to guide you through the model and some of the assumptions we make, etc. And then I will look at varying levels of variable renewable energy penetration and what this means for South Africa. And then I will output some of these visualizations with some cool visualizations we've made at NREL. And finally, I will take you through the work that we're intending to do into the future, which involves improving solar and wind resource profiles. So for chapter 1, this is a map of South Africa, and we also model the same 27 regions mentioned earlier. The detail of the model involves these yellow nodes, which basically give us the option of geographical resolution of the model. So each one of these yellow nodes here we can use for adding a generator or adding a point of load or any other object we wish to model. And the red lines represent the transmission lines, which will enable us to reflect network constraints. So we also use Plexos, which Jared explained, for capacity expansion. It comes up with the least cost build plan for South Africa. And we can also use Plexos for operational modeling, which is looking at the actual operation of the system, and it's trying to get the cheapest way to operate the system given a certain build plan. So we're also very proud of the fact that it's multi-nodal. It takes a lot of disaggregation. It also takes a lot of computational resource as well. And we are modeling the South African system as it is today. So this is current operations, current assumptions, predictions, etc. And we have the transmission plan to 2020 and also the plan for generators that are within the procurement process. So one of the things you can do with a disaggregated model is you can have regional load forecasts, which we do, and also regional wind and solar hourly profiles, which gives Plexos the option to build wind and solar where the resource is greater. And I have to put a caveat here, so we do have transmission limits in the model, but we haven't been able to activate them just yet because we're waiting on some data to do it properly, and I'm going to explain this a little bit later on. So for the capacity expansion, we run 35 years in a single step. And this is expanding just generation currently, and it's optimizing for the lowest net present value. So we have build costs entered into the model, which actually came from EPRI. And it also has an understanding of an approximate view of the OPEX savings that you can have into the future for each generation type. And it combines these things together for the cheapest total cost, and it gives you the build plan, which is going to give you the total production cost, which is as low as possible for South Africa. And then we can pass this build plan to an operational model, which we also run for 35 years. And originally, it runs with yearly step sizes. This is to look at large temporal constraints like monthly hydro limits, and then it decomposes to daily step sizes. It optimizes again, and it proportions all the results to an hourly resolution. So all the generation dispatch and everything we can see at a per hour basis. And it has much higher operational details compared to the capacity expansion. It involves things like better heat rates and ramp rates and stuff like that. And it is trying to minimize the unit commitment and economic dispatch costs of running the system. And from this, we can take the cheapest OPEX. So typically, the operational model would only be run for 1 to 5 years or something like this because it's very intense for computational resource. But we have a supercomputer with over 60,000 cores at NREL, and we can split it up, and this enables us to do this analysis. Okay, so the scenarios that we went through with this model. And there is a lot going on in this graph, so bear with me, I'll try and guide you through it. This is the total cost of running the South African system with varying levels of VRE, which is variable renewable energy. And when I say that, I refer to wind, solar, and CSP. So let's start with the x-axis. You can see there's two points to mention about this x-axis. The first is if you add no extra VRE to the build plan compared to what we have today, by the end of 2035, you'll have 6 gigawatts. So we're looking at 10 gigawatt increases to that. So we're looking at a situation of 16 gigawatts, 26, 36, etc., to 196. And I know that sounds like a very large number, but I mentioned two things. First of all, the load in this case is forecast to increase over the entire 35 years. And also, we just wanted to see what limits we would hit and what would happen to the system if we went way beyond what may be considered reasonable. So the second thing is we chose 2035 because it's far enough into the future to have interesting results optimized from Plexos. But obviously, the further you go into the future, you have to be careful about predictions, etc., becoming less accurate. And so each one of these cases will take the 16 as an example. We're basically saying to the capacity expansion model, you have to have 16 gigawatts of VRE total by the end of 2035. So it will already have 6 if it does nothing. It's got a choice of building an extra 10, but what VRE it chooses to build, where it chooses to build it, and the same for thermal generation and everything else too, is completely optimized by the model. And then the capacity expansion model will come up with a build plan, and this will have a cost associated to it, and that's the blue region there. And then we take this build plan, we put it into the operational model, and we say optimize the system as cheaply as possible given this build plan, and that reveals the red OPEX area there. And then the two combined we're calling TOTEX, and that is the purple line at the very top. So the costs are an average annual cost of the total production cost for running the South African system, averaged over a very long period, so we can incorporate the savings that different plants have over the entire lifetime of those plants. So again, as a modeler, I must always put caveats in. Of course, this analysis is for current system assumptions and forecasts and operations, etc. And one thing I will mention about Plexos to explain this suggests potential cost savings is that it's a transport model. It's meeting the demand, in this case every hour, with varying generation. So it does not consider such stability analysis like voltage requirements and megavar requirements and things like that. So when you look at the 96 gigawatt case being the cheapest TOTEX, we're not saying this is the best case for South Africa. We're saying that you can save the most production cost in South Africa given our assumptions if these situations are possible, but you would need additional stability analysis to verify each one of these penetrations. So I explain the numbers. The blue CapEx line here starts off fairly flat, and the reason for that is as you're adding increasing levels of renewable energy, it's mitigating the requirement to add capacity from thermal energy, but quite early on these numbers increase because you still do need the controllable thermal energy to some point. But even during this time, the TOTEX is still going down because the fuel savings from the renewable energy is greater than the extra CapEx costs. And we hit an optimum when we hit a minimum non-variable generation requirement, which is a combination of operational requirements and also take-or-pay contracts. So let's look at that 96 gigawatt case a little closer. We'll look at the build plan. And we can see this is for 2035, so a tiny bit behind what Jonas presented earlier, and it has slightly less VRE too. We have about 60 gigawatts of wind and about 30 gigawatts of solar by the end of 2050. And this is, this is 96 gigawatts by the end of 2035 being the target there, but this is the entire horizon that we're simulating for. And yeah, it builds majority wind in order to save on production cost. And the second thing to note is that the thermal generation requirement goes up very slowly, but mostly the coal is being replaced with the cheaper and faster to ramp gas. And to explain the spike in the middle, this was one of the revelations of doing this work. So the capacity expansion model, as I said, it understands the build cost and also an approximation of OPEX savings. And this approximation in our model's case is really underestimating the savings of VRE. So it doesn't build as much as we have figured out to be optimal. But once you analyze the OPEX costs with the much higher detail operational model, you realize that these savings are far greater than the model originally thought, and that's why it has to jump up its build by 2035, which is when we've given it the target for. So let's look a little closer at this. We've run the operational model for this entire horizon, and let's take a week in 2035. This is a very high VRE week. And so slightly more detail now. You can notice a few things. First of all, in the solar dips in the evening, the thermal generation is having to ramp. There is not much gas in this case. This is because this is a very high VRE week, and gas is the marginal generator. So in all the cases when we don't have much VRE, then you see a lot more of the pink. And the dotted line at the very top is the load, and any generation above that is taken as curtailment in the model. So the wind or solar has had to be turned down in order to keep generation at demand. And also this software that generates many graphs is available on GitHub if you wish to download it and you use Plexos too. So now I'm going to look at that graph scrolling through time with a map of South Africa that will show you where the generation is happening to. And this is something that is openable right now, and you can play with it, and we can come and talk about this after the presentation, but I've taken a video just because it's simpler and I worry about it not working. This is the video creeping on. Okay, so you can see the sunrise happening there. This graph is scrolling through time, which was the previous graph we saw earlier, and you can see these generation sparkles, the amount of generation with the key here and the size there that's happening in South Africa. So as the sunset comes over, the solar yellow sparkles decrease. And this enables us to look at our analysis. I could stare at this all day. And you can hold the mouse over different regions and get a summary of what's happening at each particular hour. And also you can select whichever generation you like. So this is WindAc, of course I'm going to select wind, and you can see it's selecting wind in the southwest when the resource is better, but with adding network constraints, of course this might change. And as well as looking at the generation output, it's also interesting to see the transmission flows too. And we have the blue is the exporter and the red is the importer, so blue to red is the direction of the flows. You can jump to any moment in time, and the graph takes some time to render. And you can see the import-export between different regions, and when you hover the mouse over different regions, you also see the summary of the import and export from that region to its neighboring regions. Okay, so as we saw, all the wind is built in the southwest, but what if we add at least the cost of connecting that wind to the transmission system? Well, this is the analysis that we're working on currently, and actually we've completed it almost for solar, but not for wind, so I'm going to show you the solar visualization, but the methodology and visualization will be the same for wind too. So sorry, that's just one slide, and I'm going to jump straight onto the next video now. Yeah. So the LCOE numbers are a little bit lower than they should be, because we still need to add the land acquisition costs. If anyone knows anything about that, I'd love to talk to you. And here we can see a heat map where yellow is more expensive and red is cheap for solar LCOE. You can filter for cheapest LCOE, for example, and you can change the color scheme to be different things like capacity. You can see the bigger farms are in the less built-up areas. If we take away the filters and we zoom in, the green bars on the right, they update for what's shown aggregated on the actual screen. And you can keep the totals there if you wish to see what portion you're looking at. And as you move around, the green bars will move, but the gray totals will stay the same. It's a nice view of Cape Town there. It's a 6x6 grid that we have analyzed, and you can take a summary of each one of those 6x6 kilometers, sorry. And how this is going to change when we add these profiles into Plexos currently is we've added the transmission LCOE too. So if we look at the color scheme of that and then we superimpose just some open source transmission, although this was worked out with Plexos transmission, for visualization we superimpose some open source transmission, and you can see the further a farm is away from the transmission, the more it's going to cost to connect. And if we look at building the 30 gigawatts of cheapest LCOE for solar, it builds it very near the transmission and also in the best resource. So yeah, so the future work we hope to do is to enter in those profiles, see how this changes the results, and then finally we're going to look at the cost of expanding the transmission system in each different area, and this will enable us to have Plexos to expand transmission too. So we're not just looking at what are the costs to connect, but how much money do you have to put into reinforcing the transmission system when you connect certain plants. So we can activate the transmission constraints now, but because we have the transmission development plan to 2020, as the load increases beyond that, it just gets overloaded as you would expect, and it doesn't tell us anything. So this is future work we hope to do. And happy to take any questions now or during lunchtime.